Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, and welcome back to True Drew Podcast. It's really foggy here where I live, so it gives me hope that autumn is right around the corner. It may also have something to do with the fact that I thrifted these jack-o'-lantern candles that you can stick in your window. They're kind of like the Christmas candle versions, but with pumpkins on top. They're the coolest things I've ever found. But yeah, I'm just ready for it to not be 90 degrees outside every single day. That would be great. Not to be that person who wishes that it was a different season than what it currently is, but I am that person, and I love fall. Not much into summer. I know that's controversial, but I don't care. Give me all the spooky things. The fog, the falling leaves, apple cider, caramel corn, watching spooky movies. Ugh, I can't wait. Who knows though, maybe I'll get a Nancy Drew book in the upcoming batch that I have to read that takes place in the fall, and that will tide me over until it's actually fall. This next book we're going to be talking about today, I really didn't get a distinct feeling for when it takes place. I assume it takes place in the summer, but I'm not really positive on that. But the book we're going to be talking about today is The Legend of Miners Creek, number 107, and it first came out in 1992. So I actually read this book a while ago. This is one of the books that I selected at random when I first got all these Nancy Drew books from an estate sale back in like 2023. And I remember when I picked it up to read it for today's episode, I remember not liking it. But I'm happy to report I liked it better this second time of reading it. That doesn't always happen. But let's go ahead and talk about the book cover. So if you ever want to see these book covers that I'm talking about, I post these on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, on Wednesdays before the episodes come out on Thursdays. But this book itself is yellow and red, and it's got a lot of purple tones to it, and Nancy and George are actually on this cover. They're looking at a map on the ground, and there's an explosion in the background. And the tagline on this book cover says, "A hidden gold mine leads Nancy to new heights of danger." I like their outfits on this cover. They're both wearing jeans. George is wearing like a red sweatshirt over a collared shirt, and Nancy looks like she's wearing a darker denim jacket. It almost looks like a leather jacket though. But when it comes to giving this book cover a funny cover spoof, all I put was fire in the hole. The explosion in the background, this does happen in the book. There are several explosions in this book actually. But when it comes to giving this book cover a rating, I would give it a 3.5 magnifying glasses. I really like the covers where Nancy is not alone on the cover. Bess or George is on there with her. I think some of my favorites are Ghost of Blackwood Hall and The Haunted Showboat. But now really quickly, I'll read off the cast of characters from The Legend of Miners Creek. So first up we have Charlie Griffen. He owns this retreat that Nancy, Bess, and George are visiting, and he has a granddaughter, Rachel Griffen. Maddie Emerson is a neighbor who owns this bird sanctuary. Pete Sims is a hand on the retreat. He helps around with the horses. Elza Parker is a cook. Cyrus is Charlie's dad. He has passed, but he's mentioned in the book. Bo Dalton Eastham, who is a pilot at the airport. We call him BD throughout the book. Jeremiah Benner, who is a miner from the past. Tyler Nelson, who is Senator Callahan's aide, Shirley, Frank, and Aaron Kaufman, and Todd and Bess Smith. These are all guests at the retreat. And now before we get started, I'll read a synopsis for The Legend of Miners Creek. Nancy finds the Pacific Northwest to be a land of breathtaking beauty and heart-stopping mystery. Carson Drew's old friend, Charlie Griffen, has invited Nancy and her friends to his 800-acre Highland Retreat in the Cascade Mountains, but the sheer pleasure of horseback riding, hiking, and bird watching soon give way to the sheer terror of flash fires, deadly rattlesnakes, and unexplained mountainside blasts. Charlie had intended to sell the retreat to finance his granddaughter's education. Now the legend of an untapped gold mine hidden in the hills threatens to crush his dream into dust. Nancy follows the thread of evidence and discovers that it has become a burning fuse, a shocking secret that could explode at any moment. And now for a dramatically read newspaper headline synopsis. Long lost gold mine located. And now let's jump into the direct quotes and notes that I took for The Legend of Miners Creek. So at the start of this mystery, Nancy, Bess, and George are in a plane over the Cascade Mountains, and it's being piloted by Bo Dalton Eastham. We even get his middle name, so he must be very important. I feel like there's very rarely middle names mentioned in the Nancy Drew universe. But they're flying towards what looks like a storm, and Bess is nervous and gripping the seat so tight that George jokes she's going to break those precious nails when they go over an air pocket, and then George gets scared. Serves you right, George. But Bo, who insists they call him BD, says he's flown this route from Seattle to Eagle Point for 20 years now and they'll be fine. All the same, though, the girls are happy once they land on the ground. Charlie Griffen and his granddaughter Rachel, who is a teenager, are there to pick them up. The book says Nancy hasn't seen Charlie in years, but her grandparents had enjoyed stays at his rustic resort, Highland Retreat. Nancy has never met Rachel, who has been living with Charlie since her parents died. But they all greet one another, and Charlie says they'll go get lunch on the way back to the retreat. BD also asks if they're still on for cribbage Thursday, and Charlie says sure. So they drive off, and Nancy says they'll get to talk more about the sale of the retreat over lunch. George makes the comment BD is quite the pilot, and Charlie says he's flown so many guests out to the retreat, and if it weren't for him and his airport, he wouldn't have been in business for as long as he has been. Nancy casually remarks that BD seems more like a mountain man than a cribbage player, and Rachel says he's a bit of everything. He's also an unofficial Eagle County historian. I don't know, but the initials BD kept making me think of something, and maybe it's BM, like bowel movement, bowel dysfunction. I'm sorry, I'm immature. I guess if you really think about it, you can come up with almost any inappropriate reimagining of somebody's initials. Oh wait, Beady Eyes Ranch from Shadow Ranch, the game. Yeah, that's much more appropriate. So anyways, George says BD did tell them about how the area was settled by fur trappers and gold prospectors. So they all grab lunch at a place called Miners Creek Saloon, and Charlie says he's selling the retreat to the government and the money will pay for Rachel's college education. Charlie seems sad about selling because it's the only place he's ever loved. Rachel seems sad too, but she says she wants to be a marine biologist. So Rachel and Charlie say strange things have been happening at the retreat, like some paperwork from Senator John P. Callahan has gone missing, and they really need that before the sale can move forward. But it keeps getting lost in the mail, and Rachel says there have been some fires also. Charlie says he thinks guests could have accidentally set those, but when Nancy asks if there were any cigarettes or matches found, Charlie and Rachel say no. After lunch, they head for the retreat, and they actually smell fire as they approach, and they see some grasses on fire. It looks pretty contained, but the wind catches it and it starts to spread. So they all grab shovels to dig up the dirt and grass to create a line, a fire line, so the fire can't cross and catch the retreat on fire. When suddenly an older woman shows up asking what's going on. Her name is Maddie Emerson. She is a neighbor who owns a bird sanctuary. Charlie says he thinks lightning must have started the fire. So everybody's working together, and Maddie has to pull Nancy back from the flames, which catch a tree on fire. Luckily, though, a rain starts coming down from a storm, which thankfully extinguishes most of the fire. But then Maddie makes some comments like the retreat was lucky this time. That's kind of a weird thing to say right after it almost all burned down. While they're extinguishing the last of the flames, someone else shows up, Pete Sims, whom Charlie says is a hand at the retreat. Pete says he'll finish putting out the last of the embers, but Nancy hangs back with the made-up excuse of trying to find her missing watch. What she really wants to do is look around the fire scene for clues. She finds a white scrap of paper in a bush, and Pete comes up behind her asking what she's got. Nancy quickly says she found her watch, and Pete tells her to hurry and catch a ride in the van before it leaves. So once in the van, Nancy asks Charlie and Rachel how Pete is getting back to the retreat, and Rachel says he'll take the path back through the meadow. She also says Pete was in the meadow before the fire started, putting a salt block out to attract deer so the guests can watch them from the retreat. So Pete and Maddie were around the meadow before the fire started. But Nancy shows Charlie the note she found, and he doesn't recognize it. It says, LY 1319, say Labo, in Home Road, Apport, Mpl, number 653, and Re. So a bunch of gibberish, parts of different words and numbers. Nancy thinks the first line must be the date, and if that's the case, the note is referring to the day before yesterday. So George asks if Nancy thinks someone started the fire, and Nancy says maybe. But Charlie speaks up from the front and says he thinks the fire was started by lightning. On the way back to the retreat, Rachel points out Pete's house and a row of 5 cabins near a creek. So Nancy, Bess, and George freshen up and change at their cabins since they were soaked, all while discussing the fire. Nancy thinks it has to have been arson, but why would someone want to burn down the forest? George reasons that maybe it's to scare tourists away. Nancy says Maddie would like to do that, but not destroy trees necessarily. But George asks why she would help put out the fire if she started it, and Bess says maybe so they wouldn't suspect her. They all think Pete's a suspect too, just because of his proximity. So after they've all changed, they go to have dinner with Charlie, Rachel, and the other retreat guests. Nancy wants to look at a display in the lodge's main room, and inside it there's a small piece of white quartz with gold running through it, a miner's pickaxe, and a mining pan. Rachel says the quartz was given to Charlie by his dad, Cyrus, and it was found near Miners Creek by a prospector named Jeremiah Benner back in the day. This reminded me so much of Last Train to Blue Moon Canyon and Jake Hurley. But also, the description of this display in the retreat kind of reminds me of White Wolf of Icicle Creek also. So Nancy and her friends start to sit down to eat, but she overhears Charlie and someone else arguing outside. The other voice says, "You don't seem to understand how serious this matter is. The senator isn't going to be pleased. Any more problems and the park deal is off." So Nancy goes closer to listen, and Charlie spots her, so she has to think fast and says, "Dinner's ready." Nancy does see the other man, though, and Charlie introduces him as Tyler Nelson. Tyler is an aide to Senator Callahan, and he says the senator is beginning to think the land is too dangerous for a state park. So they all go in to have dinner, and the girls are introduced to the other guests, Shirley and Frank and their young son, Aaron Kaufman, and some newlyweds, Todd and Bess Smith. Then Charlie shares with them the legend of Miners Creek. He says Jeremiah Benner was a prospector in the area 70 years ago, so I guess that would put it in the 1920s. He supposedly found one of the richest gold mines in the area. He searched all one summer and part of the next before he was seen running into town shouting, "I'm rich!" Really subtle. You know, if I ever found a gold mine, I don't think I would be running into town going, "I'm rich!" I would go buy an Italian villa and some first edition Nancy Drew books. And that would be that. So Charlie says Jeremiah gave Cyrus his father the quartz and had one for himself, but he never would tell him where he found the source of the gold. He wandered in and out of the mountains for about a month before finally disappearing. His burro just wandered into the barn one day by itself, still had the saddle on it. And Charlie says his father died of smallpox shortly after. But Rachel and Charlie say they'll all ride to Prospector's Canyon the day after tomorrow. Tyler says the scenery around the North Meadow is much nicer, but Rachel says they'll make a point to see both places. Then Tyler excuses himself from the table, and George says if she didn't know any better, she'd think Tyler wants them to stay away from Prospector's Canyon. Now later after dinner, the others gather around the fireplace with some hot tea, and Nancy and Charlie talk some more about the land sale. Charlie does admit after Nancy says someone could be sabotaging the sale that maybe the fire wasn't started by lightning. But when Bess and George suggest Maddie or Pete could be behind it, Charlie says that's nonsense. So Nancy asks if Pete would be able to stay if the land becomes a park, and Charlie says no. He's lived there for 20 years, but the contract only allows Charlie to continue living there, not Pete. But Charlie says Pete wouldn't have started the fire. That's a very clear motive, though, getting kicked out of the place that you've lived your entire life because the landowner is selling the land that you live on. That makes him a suspect. Charlie also says he's gotten a second offer on his land from the Nature Preservation League. It isn't as much as the offer from the government, but he shows the letter to Nancy that's from a Roscoe Johnson. Nancy takes the letter so she can investigate the lead. But just as they're about to go back to their cabin, Rachel exclaims that the gold quartz is gone. She's upset, and she said she left it out on the shelf after showing it to them, and it's very valuable. They look around for a little while, but they don't see it. But it's obvious that somebody at the retreat took it. So Nancy, Bess, and George go with Rachel the next morning to examine where the fire started. On the way, they see the Kaufmans, and their young son Aaron is showing them an ordinary rock that he insists is gold. They look around where the fire originated, and Nancy sees tire tracks. Rachel says there are old logging roads all throughout the woods. So Nancy thinks their best clue is still the note she found. Rachel gets scared of a water snake on her way to show them some salmon beds in the creek she helped her store. She says Maddie also helped her do it. But while the girls are leaving the woods and climbing up a hill, they see a Jeep roaring towards them and no one is at the wheel. So Nancy runs after the Jeep as it's barreling towards a small truck that's making a gas delivery to the retreat's gas pump, and somehow she not only catches up to it, but she opens the door and jumps in. The steering wheel is tied in place and a board has been put down on the gas pedal, so Nancy kicks it off the pedal and hits the brakes, stopping the Jeep within inches of the truck and stopping an explosion. I mean, really, all you can do is give a slow clap after that because what on earth? Nancy is insane. She's a stunt driver. So the truck driver who was delivering the gas and some of the retreat guests congratulate Nancy, and of course she's embarrassed. but she asks Rachel whose Jeep it is, and she says it belongs to the retreat and it's usually parked by the barn. So Nancy goes up towards the barn and they overhear voices. Nancy and Rachel sneak into the hayloft using a ladder outside, and they see that it's Maddie and Pete. Pete says it's not fair, he's being kicked out of his home, he's been there for 20 years. And Maddie says she understands, and the last thing she wants is city folks stomping through the woods. But suddenly there's a creaking sound and the two stop talking. Pete goes and opens the barn door, and Bess and George tumble in. And when Pete asks what they're doing, Bess blurts, "Looking for lunch." Oh, I love her so much. And George says she means horses. So Nancy and Rachel come out of the loft, and Nancy says they're trying to figure out who sent one of the retreat's Jeeps out on a collision course. Pete says he doesn't like people accusing him of things, and Maddie says neither does she, nor does she like people listening in on her conversations. So Nancy tells them what happened, and Pete and Maddie both seem surprised, as if they didn't have anything to do with it. Pete says he's been brushing and feeding the horses, and Maddie came over to see how the fire got started. Maddie says she did see a rig parked up on the road earlier on her way over, though. So she leaves, and she tells Pete he'd better go check on the Jeep. As the girls walk out of the barn, George wonders if Maddie was encouraging Pete to go to the Jeep to get rid of any evidence, and Rachel defends Maddie when suddenly there's an explosion. So they run in the direction they heard it from, and Rachel sees all her work. A year's worth of work done on those salmon beds is now ruined. She cries as Charlie and next Pete show up. Pete says he just got done untangling the ropes that tied the Jeep's steering wheel when Nancy asks where he was. As Charlie says he's going to call the sheriff and they all start to leave, George falls as a puff of smoke comes from a rock in front of her. They help her up out of the creek where she fell and find a blasting cap on the ground. Pete says they're usually attached to a fuse and put in a stick of dynamite. So Nancy asks how long a person would have to get away after setting one up, and Pete says 10 or 15 minutes, maybe longer if the fuse was longer. So Nancy pockets the cap as evidence, and they all look around, but they don't see any more. Now, when they all get back to the cabin, Pete goes to do chores in the barn, and George goes to change. Tyler is reading a book on the porch, and Nancy notices the bottom legs of his pants are water-stained. Something tells me he wasn't doing swimming aerobics. But Tyler says Aaron told him there was a big boom, and he asks what happened. Rachel says someone blew up the dam she made for the salmon to spawn in, and Tyler seems concerned about another accident, and Nancy says quickly that it can be fixed. Tyler says protecting the salmon is a top priority for the government. And I know he's being completely serious here, but that just struck me as very funny, like, protecting the salmon is a top priority for the government. So Rachel goes to help make the finishing touches on lunch, and Nancy points out the bottom of Tyler's pants legs and says, "Looks like you were in the creek." And Tyler says only the part behind his cabin, looking for black sand. Okay. Is that some kind of art project you're working on? Like one of those little sand bottles that people used to make? Someone please explain. But the book Tyler is reading is called Prospecting History and Methods, and Nancy says, "I thought you weren't interested in gold." And Tyler says, "I'm not, but Senator Callahan is. He says if there is gold on the property, it could complicate making the land a state park." So after this, everyone eats lunch and the sheriff comes to file a report. The girls go over to Miners Creek and they set up some hammocks to read. Tyler let Nancy borrow the book, so she's reading it. She says her only suspects are really Pete, Maddie, Tyler, and whoever had the rig parked up at the road. But Bess and George fall asleep in the hammocks for a little while, and then Nancy suddenly jumps up, startling them both. She runs back to their cabin, and Bess and George follow. Nancy pulls out the note she found and says it's going to help them solve the mystery. Well, I should hope so. It's the biggest clue and lead that you've had so far. But Nancy says it's an assay report from a laboratory and it resembles some of the ones in the book she was reading. She says the first line is the date and the third line is the address of the lab. The note starts to look like it says Assay Laboratory Report Sample Number 653 and Highland Retreat. So while they're talking, someone on the other side of the cabin screen door says, "Did I hear someone say gold?" And it's B.D. Eastham, and he says he was bringing Charlie supplies in his mail. When Nancy asks about the history of the area and gold being in Miners Creek, he says he doesn't think there is any, and that they could be doing much better things on their vacation. He also says, after Nancy tells him about all the disasters that have happened at the retreat that day, that a lot of bad things have been happening since Charlie said he wanted to sell the land. Maybe he should just give it up. Oh, but wait a second. Beatty gets the mail. Maybe he's the reason the paperwork keeps going missing to finalize the sale. I'm just going to throw that out there. So while they're talking, Charlie and the sheriff come up, and the sheriff says anyone could have started the Jeep because Charlie leaves the key on the dash. I love how these people always leave their car keys out where anybody can just get them. But after the men walk off, Nancy shows Bess and George a picture of a gold nugget in the book worth more than $1,000. So if someone found an entire gold mine, it would be worth millions. So Nancy asks Rachel if there are any more documents between Jeremiah and Cyrus about the mines, and she takes them to look at some things in a box. She shows them a picture of the two of them. At dinner, BD joins them, and he's invited to go to Prospector's Canyon with them the next day, but he says the only gold out there is fool's gold. So when dinner is over, Beatty gets up to leave, and Nancy and George go with him to the door. Nancy comments on how rough of a flight they had the other day, and she asks how Tyler's flight was the other day. Beatty says it was smooth as silk, and a day before, Tyler told them he got into town. So Tyler lied, and he was around the morning of the fire. So next, Nancy calls the Nature Preservation League, and she leaves a message saying she wants to donate, then gives them Carson's number. She also calls her dad to let him in on the plan. She wants to see if it's a legitimate agency because she wasn't able to find it in the phone book. Now the next day the girls check to make sure all the guests have alibis, and they do. Then they all go on a trail ride led by Pete and Rachel. But about halfway down the trail, Nancy's horse gets spooked by a buzzing noise and almost goes over the cliff. Someone put a sack full of rattlesnakes in the middle of the trail, so they all have to turn around and go back. Who would do something like that? That is diabolical. Also, how did you wrangle that many rattlesnakes and put them into a bag? I don't want to know. But Nancy, George, and Rachel decide to make another go of it, and they try to go to Prospector's Canyon again. Nancy's horse, by the way, its name is Heather, which I thought was funny. Heather is the name of a girl leading a clique at school in the 80s, not a horse. That would be like naming your horse Jessica. However, it's still better than the name of Ned's horse in the Flying Saucer mystery because Goalpost? So Nancy, Rachel, and George look around Prospector's Canyon and they see all these holes someone's dug, as if they've been searching for gold. Nancy also finds a pick and a shovel and a pouch with a note in it. It's a map marked off with X's that correspond with the holes that have been dug. So someone has been very busy off in Prospector's Canyon, and that explains why somebody threw some rattlesnakes in the middle of the trail. They didn't want anyone to see what they'd been doing. So when the girls get back to the retreat, Bess is on the porch waiting for them, and she says she thinks she solved the mystery. She tells them she saw Pete and Tyler talking near Tyler's cabin earlier, but they stopped when Bess saw them. And Pete was also unsaddling a horse that looked as if it had been ridden very far. So I guess she's implying maybe he rode ahead of them, put the rattlesnakes in the trail, and then rode back, and then went with the group on the trail ride. But Bess also shows them the missing gold quartz and says she found it behind the grain can in the barn, which is kind of Pete's domain, so that does not look good for him. But the girls eat dinner, and it makes sure to tell us that Bess is snacking on celery. Why she can't have a full meal like everyone else, I don't know. But while they're all talking and eating, they hear a crash from the other room. All of the things from the retreat's prospecting display have been thrown on the floor, and Nancy sees the shadow of a man darting off the porch. So Nancy runs after the person and runs straight into BD, who says he's there to play cribbage with Charlie. She also finds out Tyler went into town 30 minutes ago to mail something to the senator per Charlie. BD quickly says he could have taken it, and then he and Charlie go off to play cards while the girls help Rachel straighten up the display. Nancy wonders what the person who ran away was looking for. They look through all the pictures and other items, and then Nancy has a hunch. She takes some forks and pries at the pickaxe's handle and finds out that it's hollow. There's a map inside that Jeremiah made of Prospector's Canyon. Nancy points out there's caves shown on the map that they didn't see in person the other day, and she wonders if a rock slide could have covered them. So they decide to all keep the map a secret for now. Now the next day, Nancy gets Rachel to take her to see Maddie, and she's wary at first, I guess because she knows that Nancy is suspicious of her. But then she talks to them and shows them an eagle that she's rehabilitating. She says they can't get too used to humans or they'll be too tame to re-release. So Nancy says the quiet part out loud, and she's like, "So you would like to keep people away from here, right?" And Maddie says, "Sure." She also says she has plans for expanding her bird hospital, but she doesn't elaborate on where she's going to get those funds from. Nancy also asks if she's seen anyone around or near her property, and Maddie thinks Nancy and Rachel are accusing her, and she asks them to leave. But as Nancy and Rachel head to the door, Nancy sees a blasting cap on a table in Maddie's house. So she asks her about it and she says she found it outside, and she doesn't elaborate. Now after Nancy and Rachel leave, Nancy says maybe Maddie and Pete are working together to find the gold and are sabotaging the retreat, but Rachel says Maddie wouldn't destroy the salmon beds, she helped make them. So on the way back, they encounter George as they approach the lodge, and she says she helped in the barn to keep an eye on Pete for a while, but when he started to get suspicious, she went for a ride. Nancy, meanwhile, goes back to their cabin, and she notices the door is cracked open. When she goes inside, she sees the place has been torn apart. Thankfully, the map is in her pocket, but she finds that the assay report is missing. Nancy also finds Bess laying in the bathroom floor groaning. She has a lump on her head. She says she came in, saw her suitcase was open, heard a noise in the bathroom, and went to check it out, and that's all she remembers doing. So Nancy runs to get help and gets Charlie, Elza, and Rachel. George shows up and says Pete was gone from the barn and could have done this, but Elza looks shocked that George would blame him. Nancy quickly does some damage control and she says Tyler could have also been responsible. Charlie says he went to the post office again though. Now after Bess is taken to a clinic by Elza and Rachel, Nancy tells Charlie to gather all the documents on the sale of the property and to call the sheriff in 20 minutes if she and George aren't back. So the two of them go to Tyler's cabin to poke around. They find some political books and then the letterhead of the Nature Preservation League. Why would he have that? But Tyler comes back, so they sneak out of the back door of the cabin with their evidence and they go back to Charlie and show him. Nancy next calls Carson, who did some digging, and he found out Tyler comes from a wealthy family in Seattle and he would have enough money to buy the Highland Retreat. So Nancy hatches a plan to catch the thief. She says they're going to use the map to do this. So she tells Charlie tonight at the barbecue she wants him to carry it around in an envelope in his jacket and let everyone know that he has it. She has George put some black sand in the envelope and Nancy copies the map on another piece of paper. She also says they're going to put sand in the folded up map and Charlie should make a show of hanging his jacket up in the lodge. Then when they go back to check on it, they'll know someone else has looked at the map if the sand has fallen out of it. So the barbecue is later that night. Bess is fine, but the doctor insists that she stay at the hospital for the night just in case. Elza says Bess made it seem like Nancy had a plan for catching the crooks, and she makes the comment, one girl in the hospital is enough. So Nancy downplays it and she says, nah, we're just going to have fun at the barbecue. So at the barbecue, Charlie makes a big show of telling everyone in attendance about the map. And then Rachel accidentally on purpose spills barbecue sauce on his jacket. So he takes it to the house. Not long after, Pete, Maddie, BD, the Smiths, and Tyler say goodnight in that order. Shirley Kaufman also comes up and she apologizes to Rachel for Aaron taking the gold quartz. She says she gave it to Pete to return to them, but he put it in the barn. Interesting. Was he going to keep it or did he not have the chance to return it? So anyways, they all gather and sing around the campfire, clean everything up, and then go back to the lodge. When they check the map, sure enough, the sand is gone, so somebody took a peek at it. So the next part of Nancy's plan is to meet outside the cabins at 3 a.m. and go stake out Prospector's Canyon to see who shows up. So Nancy, Rachel, George, and Charlie go, and BD shows up. Charlie doesn't want to believe that his friend would betray him, so Nancy steps out to confront him. BD admits to everything, even making up the Nature Preservation League in order to stall the sale. But when Nancy says they can share the gold, he gets nasty with her. So Charlie steps out with the others and they all confront him. But BD has a stick of dynamite up his sleeve. Maybe that's what his initials can stand for, BD, blown dynamite. He lights the fuse, throws the dynamite down, and then everybody has to duck for cover. A hole is blasted in the side of the mountain, and BD is running away, but the sheriff shows up right on schedule because he's also in on the plan. So BD is arrested. The group then goes back to check out the hole, and they find a mine shaft and the skeleton of Jeremiah Benner. Okay, this is a lot like the Last Train to Blue Moon Canyon game, and next to him are 2 saddlebags full of gold. So they assume that he just got caught in that rock slide and couldn't get out. But at the end of the book, it turns out Tyler is actually a nice person. Charlie is going to make the place a wildlife refuge, and Tyler says the senator is going to help Maddie get her funding for the bird hospital. Nancy, Bess, and George at the end of the book also get these beautiful gold quartz necklaces, and Charlie tells them he's going to start a line of jewelry called Highland Gold. And that's the end of the book. So now let's go on to a little segment that I like to call What's Cooking. So there were a lot of mentionings of food in this book, so prepare yourself. There were pancakes mentioned, potato salad, French bread, regular salad, fresh fruit, iced tea, celery, roast turkey and potatoes, brownies, corn and gravy, cheeseburgers and fries, hot tea, potatoes, venison, German chocolate cake, sausage, blueberry muffins, bacon and scrambled eggs, juice, hot cocoa, chicken salad sandwiches, peaches with milk, which that's odd, I've never tried that before, jam-filled Danish pastries, orange juice, roast beef sandwiches, corn chips, and lemonade. That was a lot. Now let's go on to a segment that I like to call Add That to Your Resume. So I think we've already used this one at some point, but I put stunt driver. It has to be reiterated. Nancy has rolled out from in front of cars. She's jumped into cars to stop them from running into gas tanks. She's done it all. And I also said dynamite dodger. When BD threw that dynamite stick at them, they literally had to jump out of the path of danger. Okay, so now really quickly let's talk about the things I liked and the things I didn't like about the Legend of Miners Creek. The things I liked, I really liked that this one reminded me of Last Train to Blue Moon Canyon. And I didn't like the rattlesnakes in a bag, like just having to picture how those ended up in that bag in the first place was just horrifying to me. But when it comes to giving this book a rating, I would give it 4 magnifying glasses. I actually enjoyed this one much more the second time around. The first time I read it, it didn't leave a huge impression on me. Maybe that's because I was reading a bunch of them at the time. I mean, I'm typically reading a Nancy Drew book at any given moment in time, but this one, it was much better. So if you've read it once, maybe try reading it again and looking at it from a different perspective. So that concludes this week's episode. For the next episode, we're going to jump into the next book, The Secret of the Tibetan Treasure. So if you like books that find Nancy at a museum where a priceless artifact has been stolen, you're definitely going to like this one. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.